if you see the red light, yeah?
Yeah.
Great. We have a few folk who follow us online, Ian, who's in South Africa, and several others, so this is why we make provision for that. But this week is a tremendous word, and it can bring enormous freedom and meaning, but it's the most countercultural word of the series. So last week, I think it was last week or the week before, when I spoke, the word was sorry, which was the most difficult word in the series. This week is the most countercultural word of this whole series. And I'll get into it like this. You can think about two different ways of doing your life. And you could express it physically, right, with your body. And I want you to do it with me. Follow with me, right? You can take your hand and you can squeeze it into a fist. Let's all squeeze it into a fist, right? The one hand, squeezing it into a fist. As if there's something on the inside of that and you want to hold really tightly to what's in there. And you're clenching it, you're squeezing it, and you don't want to let it go. Okay? Are you doing that?
I don't know what we're doing though.
And you can go through life that way with everything in your life. Your stuff, your family, everything in your life. You can go through life like that. You can live this kind of life, or you can take your other hand and you can just do this. Right? This is an open hand before God. And where you can say, God, whatever comes into my life, everything that you bring into my life, I hold it loosely. Right? And I could share it easily. And I can trust you fully with what you give me, what you bring into my life. And I can go through life like this, or I can go through life like this. And you can relax now. The word that's behind this kind of life, though, is the word enough. Enough. To say, God, I'll trust you, and I'll trust that you'll give me enough. I'll believe that with all my heart, that you are the God of enough. That you are the God of abundance. So I don't have to be a taker, and a grabber, and a snatcher, and a clinger onto her. Right? So many people go through life as takers. And you can smell it. I have a taker on the inside of me, if you didn't know that, and you do too. You have a taker on the inside of you. I don't want to be a taker. I want to be a giver. I want to live my life with an empty hand that actually starts by saying, enough, I have enough. God, thank you. I have enough in my life. I've had enough. I don't need more to make me feel fulfilled and satisfied, or make you want to love me anymore. I have enough. In fact, the inability to say enough, which is rampant where we live in the south of England, or in the West, if you would, it's actually fatal. And this is true for many species. Take a goldfish bowl. Anybody ever had goldfish in their home? We have. Okay, you take a goldfish bowl, and if you think, it must be so dull being a goldfish, all they're doing is swimming around in circles or whatever. There's not much for a goldfish to do. I feel so sorry for this goldfish. And then you were to take all that food in that container and you just dump it in there. I feel so sorry for this goldfish. Let me just give him all the food. Right? I'll pour it all into the bowl. What would happen to that goldfish? It will die. Because a goldfish is not smart enough to be able to say, enough, I've had enough. It will just keep eating and eating and eating itself into death. Actually, that gets into people too. This is true even at the level of food. There's a Stanford researcher who has done quite a famous research project on this. And they asked people in France, Parisians, right? When do you know that you've had enough? When do you know? And very interesting, in Paris, the most common answer is, when I feel full, When I feel full, then I stop. I just say enough. How's my French accent? Yeah? I just say enough. When I'm full, I just say enough. They asked people in America, and I think it was in Chicago where I used to live, great city, the answer was completely different to the Parisians. Right? People said either when the food's all gone, And when my plate's clean, or when the television show I'm watching is over, and when I'm done eating, then that's it. Then I call it quits, and then I figure I've had enough. They did these experiments that became famous in social science circles, where they would give people bowls of soup, right? And half of the subjects that came to this project or this experiment, half of them got what they called bottomless bowls of soup. Wouldn't you love a bottomless bowl of soup in the wintertime? Well, they got bottomless bowls of soup. They had soup, but the bottomless bowls are actually secretly being filled from underneath the tablecloth. They find that people whose bowls keep getting filled up end up eating twice as much food as people whose bowls are not miraculously filled. And the reason is not because they're hungry, not because they need more soup. Okay, we don't need it. We don't know. The reality is when to say enough. This is true when it comes to stuff. This is true when it comes to possessions. This is true when it comes to money. We all want to think of ourselves as generous people. There's nobody here who sets out to go through life like this. Nobody sets out to go through life like this. But I want to invite you this morning to have the courage to take a look at yourself. Okay? The state-of-the-art study on generosity in our day most recently was in a book called American Generosity. Now, I know the title is about Americans. Unfortunately, it doesn't include UK stats. But guess what? I got my trusty assistant, Abigail, to do a bit of research for me to get us some local stats. But this study that they did in America, the title says American Generosity. But it finds that 84% of Americans give away 0 to 1% of their income. Either nothing or up to 1% of their income, annual income, is what they give away. In the UK, we're a little more generous. We give away about 3% of our annual income, to charitable projects or whatever it may be. Millions of people who have more than enough give away about, in the States, 0 to 1%, and for us, up to 3% of our annual income. Only 3%, give at the level of the tithe. And if you know much about the Bible, you know that God established this practice with Israel a long time ago called tithing. And tithing means that you give 10% of whatever God brings into your life as an expression of trust. God, you've given me enough. And I believe that you'll give me enough moving forward. Give me this day my daily bread, God. The God who sends manna every single day, God, as an expression of trust and generosity, whatever comes into my life, automatically I'll give you 10% immediately back to you. 97% of people who live in this land of so much abundance, of way more than enough, do not give at that level. And I would encourage you, if you're not doing that, I hope that you'll think about that today as a result of this talk. Am I going to live like this, or am I going to live like this? And there's a reason we end up living like this. We don't set out to, but there's a reason we do. And I think this week you could kind of picture it in this way. For all of us, there's whatever amount of money I have, whatever amount of money you make, my current level of income and my possessions. And then another amount is the amount I want that I don't currently have. So I have what I have, that's what I earn, and that's what I own. And then there's the amount that I want, the amount that I think would be enough. And the amount in between what I have and what I think would be enough is what we call the discontentment zone. Yeah, what I have, but what I think I want and I need, that's called the discontentment zone, in between that gap. Because I think I don't have enough right now. But if I had that much, as much as the other people do, then I would be content. We'll spend our whole lives at this particular project here. We'll work harder. We'll work longer. We'll run faster. We'll acquire more. We'll raise the level of what we have, we'll work harder to do that. And now that I have more, am I content? Guess what? We're not content. Because now I think enough would be, this is not enough. I need more. And that is just human nature. It turns out that what I thought was enough isn't enough. Enough ends up being this very elusive amount. And now I have a new discontentment zone. And people go through their whole life long and think, man, if I just had more stuff, if I just had more money. Benji would say, if I just had another device. That's my boy. If I had more money, a bigger house, a newer car. I'm not there yet, but I'll get there one day. And we think if I could just afford stuff that costs more money, if my moments had a bigger price tag to it, and we go through life thinking happiness can be purchased. If I had more money, if I had enough money, then I would have enough happy. More money equals more happy, people think. Can I just say to you, and I've met them, selfish people are the most miserable people, and generous people are the most joyful people I know. What if you were to declare enough? This is where this gets really countercultural. We live in part of the world that's going to tell you, even if you declare enough, if you're not getting more, you'll see it in social media. You've got to have more. Instagram, you've got to have better. You've got to have the new haircut or the new clothes. To say I have enough and now I want to move God into the generosity way of life. I want to live like this. It's really countercultural. But guess what? It's the only true way of joy. And so that's what we're going to learn today. We're going to learn this about a man who discovered the word enough. And this is not really about him. This is God's call for me and God's call for you. And what if you were to say enough? I have enough. God, I'm trusting you. I want to become a generous person. What if our church was to be the church of the open hand? So here's the guy and here's the story, right? Jesus entered Jericho, and you can find this in your Bibles. If you're reading your Bibles, you're going to look at Luke chapter 19 from verse 1 to 9. And it says there, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, or Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was really wealthy. From just these few words, we already know a fair amount about this man called Zacchaeus, right? Zacchaeus understood money. He got money. He was good at money. He was highly motivated by money. And we know this because Israel was occupied by Rome. And Rome had learned a long time ago that they would when they occupied a country, they wouldn't exile the people. They would leave most of them there, but they would just tax them heavily. And then Rome would get a lot of money, and that meant that they would need from that people, a few people from that community who would serve as tax collectors, right? They would be Jewish in this case, because they would be the guys who would know where the wealth is. A tax collector would be somebody in Israel who would say, this guy has 50 sheep, and this guy has 50 head of cattle, and 100 acres of land, and you could get a lot of money out of him. He would point them out. People in Israel didn't like tax collectors because they colluded with the oppressive Romans, right? If I'm a rich Israelite, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to a guy like Zacchaeus and I'm going to say to him, mate, don't tell the Romans about all my money, right? Don't tell them. You can tell them about this, but don't tell them about this. And then Zacchaeus, the tax collector, he typically would say, well, okay. But in order to keep me quiet, you're going to have to pay me off. Because I have to give them something, but if you pay me off, it's a deal. And then often what would happen is that tax collector would go ahead and he would tell the Romans anyway. So nobody liked the tax collectors. That's Zacchaeus' game. He'd already given up on relationships. He'd already given up on community, and nobody likes him, and he's okay with that because he's rich and he's really good at it. But over time, there's something kind of empty in him. There's something hungry on the inside of him. There's something kind of eating him up on the inside, and so he's interested in this man called Jesus. This rabbi, the spiritual leader. You would never expect a tax collector, let alone a chief wealthy tax collector, to be interested in a spiritual leader. But guess what? He is. It's the strangest thing. The very next verse says, he wanted to see who Jesus was because he was short, he could not see over the crowd, so he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. You'll notice in the story, there's a lot of interesting details. It's not just a tree. It says there, it's a sycamore fig tree. Almost certainly, scholars say Luke, who wrote this particular gospel, this is the only gospel that the story gets told in, right? And Luke got this directly, they say, from Zacchaeus. And he tells all of those details in the story, and that's why it's so unusual. In the ancient Middle East world, rich, powerful guys like Zacchaeus, they never ran. That wasn't dignified to run in that world. They wore robes, special robes. And you cannot run well in a robe. Zacchaeus runs, we see. And something in him really wants to see Jesus, really wants to get ahead of the crowd. And in the ancient Middle Eastern world, a rich, powerful guy not only doesn't run, a rich, powerful guy like Zacchaeus also never climbs a tree in public, ever, where other people could see him. They'd be mocked for doing that. Even in our day, rich, powerful people don't do that very much. But Zacchaeus does, because he really wants to see Jesus. And maybe he wants to hide from the crowd. I don't know. But we're told in this story that he's short. There's an old song. You might remember it. I remember it when I was in Sunday school. Do you remember it? We used to say, Zacchaeus was a very little man, and a very little man was he. Do you remember that song? There's another version to that song, and it says, Zacchaeus was a wee little man. Nobody wants to be a wee little man. Nobody likes that feeling. And maybe that's part of why Zacchaeus was so drawn to money. Money kind of makes you feel big. Money makes you feel like you're somebody, like you're special. Money will make people look at you like you must be somebody. Like you must be a big man. It's kind of wearing off for Zacchaeus, right? Like it always does. I can see Anna's doing the actions for that. I remember there were actions to that song as well. And then the most amazing thing happens here. He's up in this tree, right? And he doesn't want anybody to see him. He just wants to catch a glimpse of Jesus. He's a tax collector. Nobody likes him. He thinks he's hidden, but he's going to be able to see Jesus. Then Jesus does what nobody expects. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. Zacchaeus, he wasn't really counting on that. Everybody was like, hey, look at that guy up the tree now, you know. And what does Jesus say? Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Really? Jesus? Of all the houses in Jericho? Of all the religious people, of all the rabbis who were there, of all the devout people, you want to be with this guy called Zacchaeus, a tax collector, who colludes with the Roman government? Really? You're going to stay at this guy's house who's in the extortion business? You're going to stay at the home of this horribly corrupt bureaucrat? The thing about Jesus is this wonderful news for you and I. Whatever your financial story, maybe you've had a difficult financial life. Maybe you're in a difficult financial place today. Maybe you've even been bankrupt. Maybe you feel like a failure. Maybe you've been dishonest like him. Maybe You know somebody who's been greedy. Maybe you've cheated yourself. Maybe you've embezzled. Maybe you've been in prison, for those watching. None of that is a barrier to Jesus coming to your house today. None of that. He loves to bring grace to anybody who will just open themselves up. The strangest thing happens. Zacchaeus, who at first must have been saying, "Psst, Jesus, go away. Shh, you're drawing attention to me." Zacchaeus, he comes right down and, "Are you joking? You want to come to my house? All right, well, let's go." And this is astounding. No one saw this coming. In fact, the story goes on to say, all the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." We know how much they hate this. Quite often in the Bible, Jesus does stuff to tick one group off or another. Right? And so people mutter. Jesus had that throughout his ministry. Sometimes the Pharisees mutter. Sometimes it's the Sadducees who mutter. This is the only time in the whole of the New Testament that we're told all of the people mutter at what Jesus did. Because guess what? Nobody likes a tax collector. This is how bad these guys were. Jesus is going to the home of Zacchaeus. Seriously? But he does. And we will pick up the story in a moment. Wouldn't you love to know what that conversation was like at Zacchaeus' home? We get a kind of an inkling of what happened. We don't get to know the whole conversation until the very end. Whatever it was, it triggers these thoughts that Zacchaeus has never had before. Ever. And he starts to think about his financial life. He looks at the house that he's lived in, which he's, I'm sure, been really proud of, but it starts to look very different to him. Like maybe it's a kind of prison for him. And I wonder if Jesus was saying stuff to him like, "Zacchaeus, you know, your whole life long, you've been a money guy. Zacchaeus, your whole life, you get money, you love money, but is it getting you where you hoped it would, Zacchaeus? You used to live in a tent, and then you got a house, Zacchaeus. And then you bought riverfront property on the Jordan. And now you have the biggest, nicest house in all of town. And that's not doing it for you, Zacchaeus. How big does the house have to be, Zacchaeus, for you to be happy?" In other words, you can be satisfied, Zacchaeus, with your money, but you can never be satisfied in your money. Only in God, Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, you couldn't find joy and contentment. You couldn't surrender. You couldn't find it in all of the stuff that you managed to gather around you. But guess what, Zacchaeus? You could surrender everything to me. You could follow me. You could be a generous guy. You could use whatever resources God has given you to feed the hungry. People will bless you instead of cursing you, Zacchaeus. And these thoughts are going through, I imagine, Zacchaeus' head. And it's amazing. He had never thought about them before. He'd never had this kind of thinking before. And now it's like his heart is pounding. And then we have this very dramatic moment that comes into the story. The very next verse says, "But Zacchaeus stood up." In the ancient world, at a dinner, hospitality and civility was a big thing. Often the host of a formal banquet at some point would stand and he would recognize all the people that were there, and he would give honor to the primary guest that would be there. Most likely some official, some high-ranking official. And so it's not surprising, but Zacchaeus, when he stands up, he doesn't address the people. He doesn't go do the after-dinner speech, right? He's just looking at Jesus. And it's like for Zacchaeus at that moment, it's only Jesus and him. His heart is going to pound out of his chest, and he has to say it now. He has to express what he's feeling. He cannot wait another moment. And Zacchaeus stands up and he says this. He says, "Look, Lord." He's speaking to Jesus here. "Here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything," of course he's cheated everybody out of everything. This is Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector here. "And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Everybody is staggered. Everybody is stunned. Mrs. Zacchaeus is thinking, hey, shouldn't we have talked about this before you spoke to Jesus? His kids are wondering, does that mean I'm not going to get my own camel anymore? But Zacchaeus is so captivated by the possibility of a new way of life with Jesus and a new means of doing something with the stuff that he's been giving, that he recalculates everything in the light of the kingdom of God now. Why? Because the kingdom of God has descended onto his life, into his life. And he says, here's what I have. And what I have, but he says, for me, enough is less than what I have. This is what I have, but this is where enough lies. So here's what I'm going to do. The difference between what would be enough for me and what I actually have could become the generosity zone. I don't have to live in the discontentment zone anymore. I can live in the generosity zone. And here and now, I'm going to put my stake in the ground, is what Zacchaeus is saying. And he stood up. He's going to go public with this. What does he say? I'm giving away 50%. This is what Zacchaeus is saying. I believe that 50% of what I have with God is more than 100% without God. Isn't that incredible? That's a pretty staggering thought. He says, I'm going to make things right. I'm going to pay back all the people that I've cheated. And then Jesus stands up. And he doesn't do the after-dinner speech either. We'll talk about how lovely the meal was. He looks straight at Zacchaeus, tears flooding down his face. And you have to understand what's going on here. It says there, Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man, this wee little man, this tax collector, is a son of Abraham. This language, I've got to tell you, is not accidental. And there's a reason why Zacchaeus would remember it until the day that he died. And it's a reason those words would have struck everybody who was in that place. If you were an Israelite, about the greatest phrase you could have ever heard that could ever describe you would be to be called a son of Abraham or a daughter of Sarah. Abraham and Sarah were where Israel started. It started with them. Zacchaeus is a corrupt tax collector who colludes with the Roman government, and nobody has called him a son of Abraham for a long, long time. They've called him a son of something, but not a son of Abraham for a long time, and he cannot believe that Jesus is calling him that. What a gracious and amazing person Jesus must have been. What an amazing thing it must have been to sit down at the table with Jesus. And he says, Zacchaeus, salvation has come to this house. What he means is not Zacchaeus has bought his way into heaven. You cannot buy your way into heaven. You cannot earn your way into heaven. It comes as a gift of grace. Jesus stopped by that tree way before Zacchaeus had done anything to merit anything. And that word salvation is often translated healing or deliverance. And it means that something more than just if you believe the right thing, you get into the pleasure factory when you die. It means now, for Zacchaeus, the disease of more that has been corroding his soul is being healed. That treadmill that he's been on forever, that he's getting delivered from that. There are really smart people in the world that we live in right now, and a culture that constantly reinforces it, particularly where we live, that will say to us, guess what? Life is all about more. It's all about more. Your identity is all about more. Your happiness is all. Do you have more? Do you have bigger? You know, my kids sometimes, my eldest daughters are on Instagram and things and social media like that. And the bombardment, constantly, they're being bombarded to look a certain way, to have more, to have the trendiest clothes. And here's the thing about this word enough. Enough is not a level of wealth you achieve. It's a statement of trust that you declare.